The first time Wade Kessler asked Nora Cade for help, he stayed behind the wheel of his truck. August had burned Bellwether County nearly colorless. Gravel was white with dust. Hayfields were clipped down to stubble. Creek crossings that usually held mud in summer were dry enough to cross in ordinary shoes. Behind Wade, 12 cows shifted inside a stock trailer. They were not starving, but they were thin enough that the drought showed on them. Wade looked past Nora toward Gray Cap Ridge. "I heard you still have water up there," he said. Briar Hollow was not green in any miraculous sense. Its lower grass had browned at the edges. The spring was running below its springtime flow. But the terrace slope still carried usable forage, and a narrow ribbon of water still moved through the old stone box into Nora's livestock system. A year earlier, Wade had stood outside the county tax office and called the place 67 acres of thorns. Now his cattle were in the trailer. "How many?" Nora asked. "6 to start, maybe 8 if you can carry them." 6, 10 days, lower terraces only. You bring backup water even if my spring holds. Daily ground check. If the soil starts taking damage, they leave the same day. Wade looked at her. "You charging me?" "Yes." He nodded. There was no joke in his face this time. 14 months earlier, there had been plenty. Nora had managed the kitchen at Bellwether Middle School for 19 years. She could cost a meal to the penny, stretch a late delivery across 600 lunches. Here when a cooler compressor was beginning to fail, and reorganize 5 people's work when only 3 showed up. Most people in the county did not consider any of that preparation for farming. When the district consolidated schools the spring Nora turned 51, her cafeteria closed. She received a small severance check, a formal thank you letter, and a ring of keys she no longer needed. She took the keys home. Her house sat on 11 thin rocky acres at the south edge of the valley. She kept 9 Katahdin ewes. The lambs helped with taxes and feed, but 9 hen sheep were not a living. To build a farm, she needed more ground. Usable pasture near Bellwether was either leased, inherited, or priced for people with money Nora did not have. Then the county posted Briar Hollow for tax sale. 67 acres climbed from an abandoned logging lane into a folded ravine on the west side of Gray Cap Ridge. The listing called it unimproved upland with limited agricultural value. From the road, that description looked polite. Multiflora rows formed walls higher than a truck hood. Greenbrier braided through it. Autumn olive crowded the openings. Saplings had filled whatever pasture once existed. Some slopes were steep enough that a tractor would need more traction than the ground could give it. There was no barn, no utility service, no visible pond, and no field large enough for conventional hay. The minimum bid was $120 plus fees. Nora had $211 in checking after her final school paycheck. She did not believe the land was secretly wonderful. She believed the description was incomplete. Before the sale, she walked the lower boundary with loppers and a notebook. Under the thorns, she found woven wire grown into trees, broken cedar posts, and small patches of orchard grass where sunlight reached the ground. Then, in a damp pocket of the ravine, she heard water. She could not reach it through the briars, but she heard it. At the auction, Nora bid $120. A landlord named Ellis Munn raised her to $130, mostly because he disliked quiet auctions. Nora went to $140. He smiled and stopped. The clerk sold Briar Hollow to Nora Cade for $140. After recording fees, she had $43 and change. Outside, Wade Kessler was leaning against the courthouse wall with 2 cattlemen. "You buy the briar patch?" he asked. "Yes," Wade laughed. 67 acres of thorns, that ought to keep you busy. One of the other men said, "Maybe the county will let her serve lunch up there." Nora did not answer. She had spent 19 years in a school kitchen. If she had answered every foolish remark, breakfast would never have been ready. She put the deed packet under her arm and drove to Briar Hollow. That afternoon she stood at the lower lane with the county map spread over the hood of her car. The hill did not look like an opportunity. It looked like work in every direction. The first thing Nora did wrong was try to beat it with a machine. A rental yard had an old walk-behind brush cutter. She rented it for 2 days. On Saturday morning it handled grass and light stems. By noon, rose cane had wrapped around the axle. By afternoon, the blade had left cut thorn across the ground in mats that were almost worse to walk through than the standing brush. The next day, Nora pushed higher. The cutter lost traction on a side slope and slid hard enough to knock her down. The machine stopped against a stump. Nora stopped several feet below it with gravel in one palm and the sudden realization that nobody knew exactly where she was. She sat until her breathing slowed. Then she shut the machine down, dragged it back to the lane, and returned it early. The rental owner charged her for a bent guard. That left $26 in checking. At home, Nora made coffee and opened a legal pad. At the top she wrote, "The hill is not a lawn." Under it she listed what the machine had taught her: steep ground, woody growth, thorn mass remains after cutting, roots remain, tires expose soil, water somewhere in ravine, old grass at edges. Then she wrote one question: what eats the problem without tearing up the ground? On Monday she called the county extension office. A conservation technician named Elise Navarro returned the call. She listened to Nora describe the brush, the slope, the failed cutter, the grass, and the sound of water. "How much multiflora?" Elise asked. "Enough that I think it owns the deed. Ever worked goats? No. Then don't buy goats." Nora stopped writing. That wasn't the answer I expected. People hear goats eat brush and imagine they turn 6 loose and come back to a meadow. What they get is escaped goats, worm problems, bad fence, and brush that grows back because nobody managed timing. Learn before you own the lesson. Elise gave her the name of Calvin Reese, a targeted grazing contractor 2 counties north. Calvin ran a mobile herd on utility corridors, neglected lots, and steep ground where machines did more damage than good. He was not interested when Nora called. 67 acres is not a starter job. I'm not asking you to clear 67 acres, 1.5 acres, lower slope. I fence it. You bring enough goats to tell me whether the method works. You got electric net? No. Energizer? No. Water setup? No. A pause. You got money? Not much. You're making this difficult to say yes to. Calvin came anyway. He walked the lower slope with a fencing tester and measuring wheel. Nora showed him the old grass, wire, and the place where she had heard water. He pushed into the ravine and returned several minutes later with scratched jeans. There is wet ground in there. Maybe a seep. And you may have old terrace shape. Terrace. Maybe stock paths. Hard to tell under all this. If you want to know what you bought, don't clear the whole thing. Open windows, small paddocks, see what comes back. His price for a demonstration was more than Nora could pay. Then Calvin noticed her sheep. He needed 2 ewe lambs for a niece starting a flock. Nora needed goats. They made a trade. 2 ewe lambs and $50 in cash when Nora sold her ram lambs. In return, Calvin would bring 18 brush goats for 1 week. Nora would supply labor and water tubs. He would provide netting equipment and teach her enough to make mistakes in a controlled area. Fair, Nora said. Useful, Calvin corrected. Different thing. The goats arrived in late September. Nora had spent 3 weekends opening just enough perimeter for electric net. Elise helped design the first paddock and warned her not to make it too large. Pressure is the point, she said. Controlled browsing, then move them. The goats did not charge into the briars like an army. They looked around. One doe tested the fence with her nose, got shocked, and seemed to blame Nora personally. Another reached for rose leaves. Within minutes, the herd was stripping foliage from multiflora. By the end of the first day, the paddock did not look clear. It looked readable. That was the word Nora wrote in her notebook. Readable. Bare stems remained, but light reached the ground. She could see the slope instead of a wall of thorn. On day 3, a level line appeared across the hillside. A bench about 6 feet wide followed the contour and disappeared into the next thicket. On day 5, another appeared above it. Calvin studied both. Those are terraces. For what? Could have been orchard, row crops, erosion control. Somebody shaped this hill. When Calvin hauled the goats away, Nora could see more ground than she had seen since buying the property. She could also see how much work remained. She had not discovered a secret pasture. She had discovered evidence that the hillside had once been used intelligently. And she had found a method that worked with the slope instead of against its weakest point. The next problem was money. Her severance was nearly gone. Substitute cafeteria work came irregularly. Winter hay prices were rising. Then Calvin called. He had 5 older does he was removing from his mobile herd. They were sound, experienced, and, in his words, ugly as fence posts. Nora asked the price. Then she laughed. I have $68. You always tell people exactly how poor you are. Only when they're about to negotiate with the imaginary version of me. Calvin was quiet. 68 down. Rest by March. You miss March, I take them back. Why? Because you fenced before you bought animals. Most people do it the other way around. The 5 goats came home in October. Nora tried not to name them. By the 3rd week, the biggest was Hazel, the white-faced one was Pearl, and the smallest, most determined doe was Lieutenant. Nora never explained Lieutenant. Winter taught her the lesson the brush cutter had not. The hill did not need one solution. It needed sequence. The goats knocked back woody growth. Nora followed with hand tools where it was safe. She left roots in steep ground until grass recovered around them. Her sheep came through rested openings later, taking forage the goats ignored. She watched ground cover and moved animals before the soil was exposed. It was slower than clearing. It was also cheaper than rebuilding a slope after she ruined it. She made mistakes anyway. A wet branch fell across the electric net one November night, draining the energizer. Lieutenant and 2 others escaped, and spent the morning eating ornamental shrubs beside a hunting cabin. Nora paid for the damage and added a sentence to her notebook. Never trust yesterday's fence. A month later, she misread the condition of one sheep beneath a winter coat and caught a parasite problem later than she should have. Elise showed her a better scoring method and explained why damp, repeatedly used ground could become a parasite trap. You don't get credit for being hard-working if your timing is wrong, Elise said. Nora wrote that down too. By January, Briar Hollow was no longer a cheap piece of land. It was a system Nora understood badly enough to know how much she still did not understand. That was progress. The spring announced itself during a freeze. For 3 nights, temperatures dropped low enough to lock Nora's home trough under ice. Briar Hollow, sheltered by the ravine, froze unevenly. Just after sunrise, Nora saw a thin strip of open water slipping beneath a shelf of stone. She pushed aside dead rose cane and found a narrow channel lined with flat rock. Not random rock, placed rock. The water disappeared beneath roots and debris, but one stone showed a worked edge. Nora called Elise. Elise arrived with Amos Pike, a retired county surveyor who still carried folded maps in his coat as if retirement might be revoked without warning. Amos looked at the channel, then at the terraces. Don't dig. Nora recognized the tone. What is it? Could be an old spring run. Could be collection. He unfolded a worn photocopy of a county map from 1891. on the west side of Graycap Ridge. Where the modern map said Briar Hollow, faded script read Larkspur Orchard. 3 short contour marks matched the benches the goats had exposed. A small square sat beside a blue line in the ravine. Springhouse, Amos said. Nora looked uphill at wintergrass, bare thorn stems, and the first pieces of ground that had stopped being anonymous. How old? If the map is right, older than the road. The name Larkspur Orchard sent Nora to the courthouse basement. She did not suddenly become a local history hobbyist. The old map mattered because someone more than a century earlier had faced the same 2 physical problems she faced now. How to hold a steep slope and how to move water through it. That made history practical. Between kitchen shifts, Nora worked through tax rolls, old advertisements, deeds, and agricultural notices. The record was incomplete, but a pattern emerged. Larkspur Orchard had operated on Graycap Ridge by the early 1880s, selling apples, pears, and grafted nursery stock. For part of its life, it was run by Abigail Rowe and her 2 adult daughters after Abigail's husband died. An 1887 advertisement read, A. Rowe and Daughters, Larkspur Nursery, Graycap Ridge. No man's name was attached. Nora copied the page. She did not imagine the Rowe women as secret heroines waiting a century to send her a message. She distrusted stories that arranged themselves too perfectly. But she knew what it meant for competence to be treated as provisional until someone else certified it. The orchard declined after a severe winter and later ownership disputes. By the 1920s, nursery advertisements vanished. Later deeds referred only to timber, grazing, and acreage. The spring system disappeared from official memory before the Briars ever arrived. In February, Amos helped Nora trace the stone channel uphill. It crossed a terrace, vanished, then reappeared below a low mound covered in roots and bramble. Nora fenced the mound into a small paddock. For 5 days, Hazel, Pearl, Lieutenant, and the other goats worked the vegetation down. On the 6th morning, Nora saw a stone corner. Not a dramatic ruin. 3 low courses of dry-stacked stone partly buried under earth. Amos crouched beside it. Springhouse, you sure? No. Nora looked at him. He smiled. That's what people say before they have evidence. Elise arranged for Dr. Renata Shaw, an agricultural architectural historian, to visit. Renata was polite to Nora and skeptical of everything else. Nora liked her immediately. They removed only loose debris by hand. The structure slowly became legible. A rectangular stone enclosure sunk into the hill, an opening on the downhill side, a cut stone spring box at the back, and the lined channel carrying water away. The roof was gone. A timber sill had collapsed long ago, but the spring still ran. Renata compared the alignment, stonework, and old map. At sunset, she stood and wiped mud from her hands. I'm comfortable saying you found the Larkspur water system. Nora looked at the water. How much of it? That's the useful question. Over the next month, the answer widened. The terraces were not simply shelves. Some carried shallow stone drains. Others had low retaining edges where runoff would otherwise accelerate downhill. The old orchard had been designed around water movement. It did not trap every drop. It slowed water, spread it, and gave more of it time to enter soil before gravity carried it into the ravine. That distinction mattered. The discovery did not make Nora rich. It gave her more things to protect while she was still struggling to pay Calvin. By March, she owed more than twice the $190 she had saved. So she looked for an asset she was not using fully. The asset was not the land. It was the goats. A church cemetery outside Ridgeline had a steep back fence swallowed by honeysuckle and brush. Machine clearing had been quoted at more than $1,000. Nora offered to put 5 goats on the worst section for 6 days. You still need hand cleanup, she told the caretaker. I'm not promising bare ground. I'm promising leaf removal and access. You do this professionally. Nora considered the question. Not yet. The caretaker hired her. The job paid $275 and taught Nora that 5 goats on somebody else's property created more problems than 18 on her own. Visitors arrived without warning. A child tried to feed Lieutenant crackers. A thunderstorm dropped a branch onto the net at 3 in the morning. Nora finished tired and underpriced. She paid Calvin. Then she raised her rates. By May, she had 3 more small browsing jobs. The money was not large, but the pattern was. The goats were no longer only a restoration cost. They were an income-producing tool. Nora added animals slowly, repaired a used stock trailer, and kept records on browse days, recovery periods, parasite risk, water use, plant response, and fence failures. People joked about the notebooks until they wanted answers. How often did multiflora resprout? How many escapes? How long between passes? What did the sheep use after the goats opened the brush? Nora could answer because she had written it down. By summer, the lower terraces looked different. The multiflora rows had not vanished. Some crowns resprouted aggressively. Autumn olive returned from cut stems. Greenbrier took any opening it could find. But repeated browsing followed by rest shifted the balance. Grass thickened. White clover appeared in places Nora had not planted. Old orchard grass spread from surviving patches. Her sheep could enter ground they had never been able to use. Elise warned her against calling that restoration. Restoration means you know exactly what original condition you're restoring. Right now you're doing recovery and adaptive management. Nora liked the phrase. Adaptive management allowed a person to learn without pretending the first idea had been perfect. In June, Renata returned with researchers and a small mapping drone. They documented the spring house, terraces, a stone-lined holding basin, tree depressions, a packing foundation trace, and the old wagon path to the county road. They found no treasure, no hidden room, no cache of papers. What emerged was more useful than a single object. A system, water collection, terrace geometry, planting rows, spring house, packing area, access route. People usually preserve a building, Renata told Nora. Here, the building is mostly gone, but the agricultural logic is still visible across the land. Meaning? The hillside itself is part of the artifact. That changed how Nora worked. She used temporary fence near the oldest stonework. She kept heavy animals away from vulnerable channels after rain. She documented displaced stone before touching it. She accepted longer water carries rather than driving across places that should not become permanent tracks. The land was hers. Her decisions were no longer only about what she could get from it. 3 weeks later, Greycap Development arrived. Martin Vale introduced himself as a land use consultant. Greycap had bought property on the ridge above Briar Hollow for a 12-lot cabin project. "We're reviewing access options," he said. Nora waited. The old wagon trace through her upper terrace was the least expensive route from the county road to the ridge. Greycap wanted an easement. They also wanted permission to test the spring as a possible supplemental water source for construction and future use. Martin presented both requests as ordinary steps in a project moving forward. Nora asked questions. How wide was the road? How much cut and fill? How much water? Where would the new drainage cross the terrace system? Martin answered the same way each time. Preliminary. "Then you're not asking me for an easement yet," Nora said. "You're asking whether I'm open to a road and water line you haven't designed." Martin smiled more carefully. "That's fair. No, it's preliminary." He laughed and left his card. Nora called Renata, then Elise. Renata told her not to allow ground disturbance near the mapped terraces until documentation was complete. Elise connected her with Thomas Wynn, a state conservation hydrologist. Thomas did not care about orchard advertisements. He cared about recharge, soil, slope, flow, and the difference between a spring that ran after rain and one that persisted through dry weather. He installed a simple measuring setup and had Nora log flow twice a week. "Don't romanticize it," he said. "A spring isn't infinite because it's old." "I don't romanticize plumbing either." "Good." Same rule. The first numbers were modest, enough for livestock with storage and careful management. Not enough to support a fantasy. Martin returned in July with a written proposal. The easement payment was more money than Nora had made in the previous year, not more than the land was worth to her. Those were different questions. The road crossed two mapped terraces, the wagon trace and the upper area feeding the spring system. The water clause allowed testing and broad future negotiation. Nora spent $85 on 1 hour with land use attorney Claire Bannon. Claire read the proposal twice. "Do you need the money?" "Yes." Claire looked up. "Can you survive without it?" Nora thought. "Yes." "Then don't let the size of the check answer the land question." She pointed to the easement language. "This protects them from future inconvenience. The water clause is too broad, and I see no reason you need to decide quickly. They said construction scheduling makes timing important. Timing is important to them." That sentence cost Nora $85 and was worth more. She declined the offer. Martin called the next morning. "We can adjust terms, then adjust the route. The route is the economic issue. I understand. Do you?" Nora looked toward Graycap Ridge. "I think I do now." The road through her property was not simply convenient. It was the difference between Graycap's project being easy and Graycap's project being expensive. For the first time since buying Briar Hollow, Nora was not automatically the person with the least leverage. That did not make her safe. It made her visible. Visibility came first in small forms. A county historical newsletter ran a photograph of the spring house. A Sunday paper printed a short piece about Larkspur Orchard. Elise invited Nora to show small acreage farmers how she was using temporary paddocks on steep ground. 26 people came to the field day. Nora worried that Briar Hollow looked unfinished until she realized unfinished was exactly what she needed to show. She walked the group through a paddock after one browse pass, another after two, and a rested terrace where grass had returned. She showed them multiflora resprouting, the wet ground she no longer grazed hard because of parasite risk, and the scars left by the brush cutter during her first weekend. A man asked, "How long until the brush is gone?" "Maybe never." The group went quiet. Nora pointed uphill. "My goal isn't a postcard. My goal is usable forage, stable soil, access, and a brush level I can manage without letting it manage me." The county paper quoted her. A regional farm newsletter repeated the story. Soon after, a power cooperative called about vegetation beneath a rural transmission spur on steep ground. The contract was larger than any job Nora had done. She called Calvin before signing. "I need more goats, more net, and somebody to tell me whether I'm being stupid." Calvin walked the site with her. "You can do it. That's not the same as saying I should. No, but you should. You have enough system now." The job went well until 2 borrowed goats developed diarrhea after a feed change. Nora pulled the herd, lost half a day, changed the rotation, and finished late. The cooperative still paid. Nora wrote down the failure before she deposited the check. Success went in the ledger too, but failures went first, because failures lied less. The money bought more goats, repaired the trailer, and ended Nora's slow monthly drain of severance savings. She was not comfortable, but the farm had stopped consuming the same shrinking pile of cash. Graycap noticed the publicity. Martin sent a narrower easement proposal. The broad future water language was gone, but the road still crossed the upper terraces. Claire rejected it. Then a survey crew appeared at Briar Hollow's lower entrance with orange flagging and equipment. They had not entered when Nora arrived. The crew chief said Greycap believed an old timber access right crossed the property. Nora asked for the recorded document. He did not have it. She asked for authorization from the landowner. He had authorization from Greycap. "You don't have authorization from me," Nora said. The crew left. 3 days later, Claire received a photocopy of a 1936 timber deed mentioning customary access along a ridge road. It had no dimensions, no mapped center line, and no clear language establishing the modern right Greycap wanted. "Is it real?" Nora asked. "The document is real," Claire said. "The right they wanted to create is much less real. Can they take it to court? Anybody can spend money taking something to court. Winning is another matter. Keep documenting what exists. Don't grant rights that don't." Renata submitted Larkspur Orchard for preliminary review under a state rural heritage landscape program. She explained the limit carefully. It would not turn Nora's property public. It would not freeze the farm in the 19th century. It would not automatically stop development. It would document that some historic sites were systems rather than single buildings, and require a more serious review when state-supported projects threatened the features that made the system legible. "This is not a magic shield," Renata said. "Good. I'm getting suspicious of anything described as magic. It gives you documentation. Documentation changes how people have to argue." That Nora understood immediately. The preliminary report listed terraces, spring house, stone drains, wagon trace, packing foundation remains, and surviving orchard geometry. It also documented Abigail Rowe and her daughters operating Larkspur under their own names for years. Renata found no evidence they became wealthy or changed regional agriculture. The record showed something smaller. They had run the place. They had worked it long enough for the hillside to preserve the shape of their decisions. Wade returned to Briar Hollow that November with his son Ben, who wanted to see Nora's terrace fencing. Ben asked about rest periods, soil recovery, and spring flow. Wade mostly listened. At the second terrace, he looked toward the stone channel. "You really found a spring house under all that?" "Most of it was under soil and roots. The goats made the ground readable enough to know where to look." Wade stared uphill. "I drove cattle through here once. Maybe 25 years ago. I didn't know that. Previous owner had the top leased. I don't remember seeing any of this." "You probably didn't. I mean, I was here." Nora looked at him. "I know." She did not mean it as an insult. It landed anyway. Being present was not the same as seeing. Winter came wet. A long storm moved water down Greycap Ridge for more than a day. Nora drove to Briar Hollow during the rain because she needed to know what the terraces actually did under pressure. They did not perform a miracle. Water spread across contour benches. Old drains carried some sideways into vegetated channels. Grass slowed sheet flow. The spring rose hard, then settled. One badly placed fence line washed loose. A footpath rutted. The hill was not invulnerable. It was functioning. Thomas reviewed Nora's photographs. "Don't turn this into a claim that old terraces prevent erosion." "I wasn't going to." "Yes, you were." Nora looked at him. "Maybe a little." Thomas pointed to the rut. "Water follows opportunity. Terraces slow some of it. Vegetation adds friction. Undisturbed soil takes more in. Concentrate flow in the wrong place and it still cuts." Nora added drainage work to the winter list. Every useful answer Briar Hollow gave her came with a condition. In February, Greycap asked the county planning board to recognize the old ridge trace as an existing route suitable for improvement. They were no longer trying to buy cooperation first. They were trying to strengthen their administrative position. Claire called Nora. "We answer with the record." For the first time, Nora's obsessive notebooks became legal evidence as well as farm management. She had dated photographs of the wagon trace before and after browsing. Historical maps from Amos, Renata's heritage report, ground measurements showing the old line broken by terrace walls. No evidence of modern vehicle use since she bought the property. Graycap had aerial images showing a faint linear opening. The planning hearing was set for March. Graycap's engineer called the trace a historical access corridor. Renata agreed that it had been access, but argued that its historical use was precisely why widening it could damage the integrity of the orchard landscape. Thomas explained that road construction near the upper contour could change drainage patterns. He did not say it would destroy the spring. He said the effect could not responsibly be assumed negligible without study. When Nora's turn came, she carried 3 pages of notes to the microphone and did not use them. "I'm not asking you to decide whether my farm matters more than their development," she said. "I'm asking you not to call an old farm route a modern road because that makes the paperwork easier. If they want a road, let them propose a road and show what it does." The board postponed Graycap's request pending a full site review. It was not victory, it was time. By then, Nora understood that time could be leverage. Spring brought livestock, mud, and another expensive lesson. A used portable water tank, advertised as recently repaired, split on its second job and dumped 300 gallons into Nora's trailer on a county road. The animals were safe. The job was delayed. The support frame bent. Mineral was ruined. Amos arrived to help move equipment. "Animals all right. Yes, then this is just money. It's a lot of money. Still money." Nora looked at him. "That sounds like something a man says when it isn't his money." Amos considered it. Fair. The failed tank changed Nora's pricing. She stopped charging only for goat days and fence length. She added equipment reserve, travel, setup, and contingency. Some clients left. The remaining work was better. By late spring, Nora had enough animals and contracts that saying yes became a management decision rather than a reflex. She could not send the best brush goats away if Briar Hollow needed another pass. She could not run sheep too tightly behind them without increasing parasite pressure. She could not accept sites full of toxic ornamentals because the check looked large. Learning to say no became part of keeping the business alive. Graycap changed its plan again. Instead of arguing that the wagon trace itself should become a road, the company proposed a new alignment slightly upslope. On paper, it avoided the visible terrace walls. On the ground, it crossed drainage heads above the spring. Thomas called the hydrologic characterization insufficient. Martin called the proposed controls reasonable mitigation. Nora called the proposal permanent access across her farm. Graycap increased its easement offer, then increased it again. The second figure could have bought Nora a newer truck, a reliable trailer, more fencing and breathing room on the mortgage at her house. She kept the letter for 3 days. Not because she intended to accept it, because she wanted to refuse the real offer rather than a villain she had created in her own head. On one page, she wrote what the money solved: equipment, debt, reserve, business expansion. On another, she wrote what the easement changed: permanent third-party access, road construction above the spring, fragmented grazing, risk to historic water and terrace relationships. Future negotiation from a weaker position. Then she emailed Claire. "No," Claire replied. "Legally sufficient. Emotionally underdeveloped." Nora laughed and told her to send the formal version. The rain stopped in June. At first, nobody called it drought. Bellwether had dry Junes before. Forecasts kept showing storms 5 days away that vanished before they arrived. By early July, pasture growth slowed. Farm ponds dropped. Hay producers cut fields earlier than normal. Nora watched the spring because Thomas had taught her to measure instead of guess. Flow declined. She reduced livestock pressure before she had to. She hauled more water to outside jobs. She lengthened rest periods. By August, Bellwether Creek had stopped running across 2 gravel bars. The county opened an emergency livestock water point at the fairgrounds. Hay prices climbed fast enough that farmers began selling animals rather than buying feed they could not replace. Nora's home pasture browned. The lower field at Briar Hollow browned around the edges. The terraces held usable forage longer, not because the hill was blessed. Old perennial roots reached deeper than annual weeds in disturbed ground. Years of brush cover had built organic matter. Contour benches slowed the small amount of rain that did fall. The spring supplied limited water because Nora treated it as a measured reserve instead of an endless pipe. None of those things made the hill drought-proof. Together, they bought time. In a drought, time was a resource. On the 3rd Monday of August, Wade Kessler drove back to Nora's gate with 12 cows in the trailer. The story caught up with its opening. "I heard you still have water up there," he said. This time, Nora had measurements, terms, and enough experience to know that saying yes without limits would be another kind of failure. She accepted 6 cattle for 10 days in the lower terrace paddocks. Backup water required. Daily soil check. Immediate removal if hoof damage exceeded what the ground could carry. Wade did not argue about the price. That worried Nora more than an argument would have. "You that short?" she asked. Wade looked toward the road. "I can buy hay for 40 head. I've got 63. Selling 10 Friday, maybe more." Nora understood the arithmetic. The 6 come today. If it works, we reassess. I am not promising more. I know. The first day was awkward. Wade's cows were used to open pasture, not temporary divisions on contour ground. One pushed a net when Nora placed it too close to shade. Another ignored the unfamiliar trough until Ben moved it into clearer sight. Nora changed the layout. That was one advantage of temporary systems. Being wrong did not require concrete removal. On day 3, Wade walked the lower terrace with her. The cattle had grazed evenly enough that the ground remained covered. He kicked at the soil. It's still soft under there. A couple inches down. How? Shade. Roots. Less disturbance. Some contour capture. He looked toward the ravine. And the spring. Down about 1/3 from spring flow. Wade frowned. "That much? That little?" Nora showed him the measuring notch. "It's not endless. I'm using it because I've been measuring it. If it drops too fast, the cattle leave before my sheep do." Wade nodded. No joke. No defense. Just information moving from one farmer to another. Other calls followed. Nora accepted a limited group of Ruth Bell's sheep into an upper paddock. When the Garrett brothers asked about yearlings, Nora initially said no. The north section had forage but no reliable water distribution. Then the Garretts offered portable pipe, posts, and labor. Nora made a different deal. They installed a temporary water line and reinforced a north paddock under her layout. In exchange, their yearlings received a short emergency stay at a reduced cash rate. The arrangement increased capacity without pretending capacity was infinite. By the end of August, Nora was managing several livestock groups across ground she had once been unable to walk through. She brought an old whiteboard from Bellwether Middle School into the barn. It had once tracked breakfast biscuits and frozen chicken. Now it tracked paddock numbers, recovery days, water demand, parasite risk, and emergency grazing. Ben Kessler recognized it. "I remember that board." "You remember being yelled at for touching it." I was 12, old enough to understand dry erase boundaries. For the first time, Nora's old job no longer felt like a history she needed to escape. She had spent 19 years moving food, labor, time, substitutions. equipment failures, and human mistakes through a system that could not stop because 600 children were arriving at noon. The animals were different. The consequences were different. The management was not as different as people imagined. By September, the spring fell again. Nora cut outside grazing before anyone asked her to. Wade removed his cattle. Ruth took half her sheep home after a small storm gave one field a little recovery. The Garrett yearlings did not receive a second stay. That limitation became part of the proof. Briar Hollow could help. It could not save Bellwether County. Nora refused to let the hill become a miracle, because miracles were impossible to manage and dangerous to believe. At an emergency pasture meeting, she showed the drought photographs and the spring flow chart. "Don't hear me saying old land never dries out," she told the room. "My flow is down. My forage growth is down. I've cut stocking. Soil cover, rest, root depth, contour, and measured water gave me more time before failure. That's all. In a drought, more time is a resource." Wade sat in the second row. Martin Vale stood near the back. Afterward, Martin waited by the door. "You've made the site politically difficult," he said. "Hello to you too. I'm not saying that as a threat. Public attention changes permitting. So does water." "Yes," Martin said. "It does." Graycap's project was still alive. But the road was no longer only a quiet engineering question. It was now a question about a working farm, a documented agricultural landscape, and uncertainty above a spring people had spent the summer discussing. The cost of helping the valley appeared after the outside livestock left. Parasite pressure increased in Nora's lower paddocks. Recovery took longer than she had priced. She bought hay earlier than planned so her sheep would not have to return too soon. Much of the emergency grazing income disappeared into recovery. When Wade came to settle his invoice, Nora told him, "You lost money on us." "Not exactly. I priced the grazing right. I underpriced what the land needed afterward." Wade reached for his checkbook. Nora stopped him. "You paid what we agreed. I learned something. Next drought costs more." Wade glanced at the barn whiteboard. "You really are a cafeteria manager." Nora almost took offense. Then she saw his face. "Former cafeteria manager," she said. "Doesn't look former from here." The drought broke in October with a slow rain that lasted 2 days. The spring rose gradually afterward, not instantly. Thomas called the delay useful information about storage and flow paths. "Good or bad?" Nora asked. "Information first. Good or bad after we understand it." Nora trusted that kind of answer more than she once would have. Graycap submitted another road design. It used engineered drainage controls and avoided direct contact with mapped stone features. The proposal was not absurd. That made it more difficult. Thomas asked how runoff assumptions had been validated without testing the soils on Nora's side. Renata asked how cutting a new road through the upper landscape preserved the relationship between wagon trace, terraces, drains, and spring. Graycap's engineer argued that physical stone features would remain untouched. Renata replied that avoiding stones was not the same as avoiding a landscape system. Nobody shouted. The disagreement became clearer because nobody needed to. In December, the state accepted Larkspur Orchard as a protected rural agricultural landscape under a preservation agreement with Nora. The agreement did not turn the farm into a museum. Nora could graze animals, manage brush, maintain water systems, and continue farming. What she agreed not to do was destroy the defining terrace network, spring structure, wagon trace, or mapped archaeological areas without review. The site also gained a formal status that state-supported development would have to address. Martin called the next day. "Congratulations. Thank you. You know this complicates our route. I assumed. It doesn't make it impossible." "I didn't assume that." A pause. "We're requesting a joint field review. Send it to Claire." Then Martin said, For what it's worth, I told the partners months ago they should redesign off your parcel. Why didn't they? Because the alternative road costs a lot more. Nora almost laughed. Then I did understand. Yes, Martin said, you did. The field review happened after New Year's on a cold morning. Greycap brought Martin, an engineer and a lawyer. The county brought a planner. Renata and a water specialist came for the state. Nora brought Claire, Amos, and a large thermos. Orange flags marked the proposed road. For the first time, Nora could see its actual width across the hill. It crossed two shallow drainage heads above the terrace system. It did not crush the spring house or bulldoze a terrace wall. The conflict was less dramatic than that. The road inserted a permanent engineered corridor across the slope that collected and moved water toward the system below. The water specialist asked how much cut and fill the steepest section required. The engineer explained retaining structures and runoff capture. Thomas asked where that runoff would discharge. The engineer pointed toward a swale. Thomas walked downhill until he could see the old stone channel, into the same drainage network you're trying not to affect. The engineer disagreed with the wording. They spent 20 minutes on that spot. Nora said almost nothing. She did not need to. The hill was finally legible enough to argue for itself. The county planner ordered a comparison of off-site routes. One alternative required a longer road and a small bridge. Another required purchasing a strip from a timber company. Both cost more than crossing Briar Hollow. Neither was impossible. That was the point. For months, Greycap's preferred route had been presented as if it were the only physical truth. The comparison showed choices. Greycap simply preferred Nora to absorb the cheapest one. The legal letters slowed. Martin stopped calling every few weeks. Then in February, Claire forwarded an email with 3 words above the attachment. They rerouted it. Greycap Development had selected the timber company alternative and withdrawn its access claims through Briar Hollow. The cabin project would continue on the ridge. The road would not cross Nora's farm. No apology arrived. No lawyer admitted defeat. Greycap ran the numbers and changed routes. Nora preferred that ending to a speech. The mechanism had always been cost. Once documentation, delay, heritage review, hydrologic uncertainty, and public scrutiny made her property expensive to fight over, the alternative became cheaper. Behavior changed because the incentives changed. Nora called Martin once. I saw the notice. I figured you would. Thank you for telling them to reroute. I told them because it was sensible. I know. A pause. Good luck with the orchard, Martin said. Nora looked at the winter hill. It's a farm. Martin did not argue. The next year made the victory smaller and more useful. A preservation grant stabilized loose stone at the spring house and mapped the most fragile terrace sections. No decorative reconstruction appeared. The work protected what remained without pretending the site had stopped being a farm. Nora added a biosecurity plan and recovery charge to any future reserve grazing agreement. Wade complained about the price on principle, then paid the deposit. Her browsing business became steady enough that she hired Maya Ortiz part-time for setup and fence work. Nora paid for drive time, too. She had spent too many years watching institutions depend on invisible preparation while paying only for the hour everyone could see. Wade and his son began resting parts of their own pasture longer and spreading water access, so cattle did not hammer the same creekside ground all summer. At an extension field course, Wade described the drought stay at Briar Hollow. A farmer asked how he had known to call Nora. Wade looked at her before answering. I'd been watching that hill for years and never seeing it, he said. She saw more in it than I did. It was not an apology. Nora no longer needed one badly enough to grade the difference. Then Briar Hollow failed in a way nobody could blame on Drought, Greycap, or the previous owners. A slow tropical system stalled over Bellwether County and dropped heavy rain for 3 days. Most of the terrace network handled the water the way Nora had learned to expect. Flow spread, slowed, and moved into vegetated channels. But one place cut badly. For months, Nora had been driving the trailer over the same convenient line near the upper slope. Repeated tires had compressed the soil and created a weak path. During the storm, runoff followed it. By the time Nora reached the site, water had opened a rut through the topsoil and exposed pale subsoil beneath. Thomas came after the rain. He looked at the damage. "That's yours." "I know. Want me to say it kinder?" "No." They closed the track, moved vehicle access to stronger ground, protected the damaged section, and let vegetation begin the slow repair. Nora photographed every stage. At the next field course, she showed the erosion before she showed the green terraces. A visitor asked why she would display a mistake that serious. "Because you'll make one too," Nora said. "If all I show you is the spring running and the grass holding, you leave thinking the land did this by itself. It didn't. And if I only show you what I did right, you won't see which decisions can undo it." People trusted the farm more after they saw where it had failed. That winter, Elise gathered farmers above the feed store to build a simple drought contact plan before another emergency existed. They listed legal water sources, trailer access, temporary grazing possibilities, fencing needs, disease concerns, and limits. When somebody suggested writing Briar Hollow as 67 acres available, Nora took the marker. She wrote, "Variable reserve capacity. By inspection only. Spring limited. Recovery cost required." Wade leaned back. "You always make the fine print larger. People read it that way." No government program appeared. No new office opened. They built a contact sheet and a set of voluntary agreements, so the next dry year would not begin with everyone discovering one another's phone numbers during the crisis. Nora trusted results small enough to maintain. One winter, Bellwether Middle School's old building was demolished. Nora pulled over across the road and watched an excavator work where the cafeteria loading dock had been. For 19 years, she had entered through that door before sunrise. The kitchen had been hot, loud, underfunded, and often invisible when it worked well. It was also where she had learned to track waste, plan substitutions, manage labor, anticipate equipment failure, and understand that smooth systems usually looked simple only because somebody had prepared for the places they could break. She opened the truck console. The old school keys were still there. For a long time after the layoff, they had felt like evidence that somebody else had decided when one version of her life ended. Now they were just metal. At Briar Hollow, Maya was repairing fence clips beside the barn. Nora held up the ring. "Scrap bucket? Do they open anything?" "Not anymore." "Then scrap bucket." Nora dropped the keys in. The sound was smaller than she expected. That was all. By her 4th year at Briar Hollow, ordinary work had replaced most of the drama. Graycap's cabins were partly visible through ridge trees, but their road stayed on the other side. The spring ran at an ordinary late summer level. Goats worked second-pass brush. Sheep used the recovered lower grass. Maya handled fence setups without waiting for Nora to inspect every knot. One September afternoon, Nora walked the upper terrace alone. The first time she had followed that line, she had not known it was a terrace. A wall of multiflora stood in front of her. She had $26 in checking and 5 goats she did not yet own. Now she could see the protected spring house below, the barn whiteboard through the open door, young pear plantings near the lower bench, and the next section of brush that still needed work. There was always a next section. That no longer discouraged her. A finished farm would have been a dead thing. At the top gate, Nora checked the latch. A pickup slowed on the county road below. Wade lifted 2 fingers from the steering wheel as he passed. Nora returned the gesture. That was all. Bellwether County had not become a different place because she owned Briar Hollow. Developers still preferred the cheapest route they could defend. Farmers still made bad decisions when weather made them afraid. Nora still made mistakes. The difference was smaller and more durable. The hill had become legible. So had the work. Not because everyone finally understood Nora, but because enough evidence had accumulated that misunderstanding no longer controlled the outcome. As evening settled into the ravine, Nora walked to the spring house for the last water check. The stone box was cool beneath her palm. Flo sat inside the ordinary late summer range Thomas had taught her to recognize. She lifted the small gate that sent water toward the livestock trough.